Welcome. So I'm going to be showing you how to do the Ruby Katas workflow in the context of Rails Quest. So let's just get right to it. First, you're going to navigate to Rails Quest Ruby Katas, and here you can see the README and the instructions. So I'm just going to walk through the instructions basically and get us to a point where we've got our first pull request that kind of moves the chains of progress on getting these katas done. So you're going to do a fork. I'll fork it to this account here. And now you're going to clone it in your preferred way. So if I take that, open up a terminal. First I'm going to, now we're going to change directories into the Ruby katas folder. So now we have all of our katas that we can dive into. Let's get started with the word count. So typically a terminal will have the editor variable set to whatever your preferred editor is. Mine turns out to be Vim. So here's a listing of the files. Let's take a look at the tests. All right, so this is the test file. Now if I run the full test suite, you'll see most of the tests are skipped, and occasionally there is one test out of the group that either fails or errors. This is by design. So let's take a look at the workflow. Let's run this one test. So you'll notice that the skip is commented out in this test. We'll just delete that line altogether. So now we're ready to begin coding. We've got a failing test. So let's take a look at the error. Uninitialized constant word count test phrase. So what this means is that we're referencing this phrase thing right here, and Ruby has no idea what it is. So let's open up the code file. This is the word count file that is being required right here. And you'll notice that it's blank. Since it's blank, it's pretty clear that it's not implementing a single thing that these tests are intended to test. So since the error is that it doesn't know, it has an uninitialized constant, which is basically Ruby informing us it has no idea what this constant is. This word phrase, it doesn't know what it means. So let's teach Ruby the word phrase as a class. Run that test again. Now we have a new error. Congratulations. You've just been introduced to the TDD workflow. TDD stands for Test-Driven Development, and that's part of the exercise that we're learning today. So that just means you start with a test that's failing, you make one small change, you run the test again. Ideally, the small change is sort of a scientific method process. So you make a hypothesis based on the error. Then you test the hypothesis by making one small change to your code. In this case, the small change that we made was adding the phrase class. So our hypothesis was proven true in this case. Not because the test is passing, it's actually still failing, but because the error changed. So that's really the only goal, is to test your hypothesis. You make a change, test your hypothesis. If you get the same error back that you had before, the same exact error, that means that your hypothesis was not correct and you need to go back and make some more observations. But if you were able to change the error, then that means your hypothesis was most likely correct. Or you introduced a new error which you now need to resolve instead. So those are the sort of branches, the decision tree of what's going on here. So let's take a look at this new error. We're going to follow this test all the way through until it is passing. So the error is right here on this line. Argument error. Wrong number of arguments given. Given 1, expected 0. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But right below it, you can see that it's telling us what line we're failing on. So let's go to that line. It's line 7 in the test file. Well, it's still a little bit confusing because it says in initialize. The interesting thing here is there's no reference to initialize. If we go one line down on the same line, you can see that it's talking about new. So let's take a look at the concept of a stack trace. A stack trace is the stack of calls that are made to get to the point of failure. So in this case, from the top down, the initialize method is the one that's closest to the actual error that's happening, the initialize method call. Then one step below that, meaning 1 degree of separation away from our actual error, is the new method call. Now you can see here we call new. And here's something about Ruby that you may not have known. It's not immediately obvious. When you call new to create a new instance of your class, under the hood Ruby is going to call the instance method initialize. So let's define that right here. Now we have explicitly defined a new initialize method. Let's run our test again. So we have the same error. The reason for this is because the initialize method we created doesn't actually change anything. It didn't address the problem. The only reason that I created this was as an illustration to show you that this is what Ruby does. So Ruby, when you call new on a class, it turns around, creates an instance of the class, and immediately calls this initialize method. And it forwards all of the parameters that you pass into new to the initialize method. So what this error means, if we can put the pieces together now, is that we were given 1 argument to the new method, but we expected 0. The reason why we expected 0 is because we've not specified any arguments that are allowed to pass into initialize. So we can fix that problem by creating a parameter that's going to receive the value that's passed into new. Let's run that test again. Okay, so now we have a new error, and you can see that it's on line 9. I'm going to call that a win because we were able to get past the first 2 lines, and now we're actually on the last line of the test, which is the assertion. The assertion is the part that proves that everything worked. And it does this by running some sort of a check on your code, depending on the specific kind of assertion that you call. So your intuition may actually tell you what assert equal means. It means that the left side, the left parameter, is equal to the right parameter. And typically, by convention, the left parameter is the one that we're sure about. This is the number we know. This is the input or the output that we expect. So this is called in testing vernacular, this is called the expectation. Over here on the right, this is the test subject. So the subject under test in this case is phrase.wordCount. So we're calling the word count method. And you can see that it's not defined on phrase. Let's take a look at the README for this particular kata. Given a phrase, count the occurrences of each word in that phrase. For example, the input ollie ollie income free would yield these results. It counts 2 ollies, 1 in, 1 come, and 1. And there's a few little instructions down here that we can ignore. So now that we know exactly what we're going for, we're wanting to count the occurrences of each word. Let's see what we can do about that. Now here's a testing principle that may actually surprise you. When you're doing TDD, you want to focus on taking the smallest action possible. This is a little counterintuitive because you might think the goal is to end up with code that accomplishes what you want it to accomplish. And that's true. But because of the nature of code and the way that often computers think counterintuitively to humans, sometimes it's extremely helpful to take a very rigorous and disciplined approach and only test one thing at a time and only implement the one thing that is currently being tested. So let's take a look at this. Test count 1 word. You can think of this as a game at this point. How can you make this test pass? You are not supposed to change these tests, but just to make things maybe a little bit clearer about what's going on, I'm not going to change how the test runs, but I'm going to change this. Just remove one variable from the equation here. What we want to see is that the word count method, when called on the phrase instance of the phrase class, will return a hash with a key of word pointing at a value of 1. So what's the simplest way to make this test pass? First, let's test that my small change does something, operates the way that we expect. Okay, now we're back to the same error. It's on line 8 now because I've removed a line. but it's the same error. So let's make the word count method. Let's see what happens. Failure. This is our first real test failure. Instead of a syntax error, we're actually getting failure output from the assert equal. What we get here is on the left side, we expected a hash with a key of word and a value of 1. What we got was nil. That's because Ruby, by default, if you don't specify any return value or you don't specify any code inside of a method, it will just by default return nil. That's the default implementation of an empty method in Ruby. So what's the simplest way? I'm not sure you're going to be ready for this answer. The simplest way to make this test pass is to simply return exactly what it's asking for. And now you can see, run it again, the test passes. So, congratulations, you made the test pass. This may seem like a pointless exercise, but as you go through, you'll see that these tests are actually written in such a way that each test builds on the last one and forces you to implement just a little bit more than the last one. So let's go through this workflow that I expect to happen in Rails Quest. Now that we've got a passing test, and if I run to test the whole file, you'll see that it passes. And you'll see that I had a bunch of skips, and that little dot there on the end is my passing test. So our goal here is to turn all of these S's into little dots that indicate a passing test over time. But we're going to do it piece by piece. Now again, I don't expect you to change the test. I encourage you not to. I did that just to clarify and illustrate a point. There was no reason for me to actually change that test, and I'll prove it to you. So I just undid all the changes in this test. The only change I expect to see in your submissions is removing the skip line. Still passing, even with the original implementation. So now that everything's looking good, we've removed the skip line. We've added a super basic phrase class. Now we've staged things. Now, before I commit this, let's make sure and create a new branch. Get checkout-b. We'll create a new branch based on master for us to put the rest of our changes on. So let's say word count 1, or word count 1 word. Okay? Doesn't matter exactly what the name of your branch is, but I like to keep it somewhat related to the actual work that was done or is planned to do. Right? So now we have those things staged. So we commit this change. And if you have the GitHub CLI installed, you can simply say GitHub PR create. You're going to pick your own repository to create as the base of this pull request. Do not pick Rails Quest or Makers Academy. Pick your own username. Again, pick your own username, even if you have access to other repositories. We're going to say word count 1 word test passes. Just something to indicate what happened. And from there you can either submit it or continue in browser. Okay, so now you can see you can see your pull request. You're going to pick a reviewer. I'm all alone on this repository, so I can't choose anyone at this moment. You can take a look at your code, make sure it's all good, then you create a pull request. You want to take a look at the actions and make sure that they're enabled. And there we are. You have a pull request and the reviewer can come in and check on your work, maybe give some guidance. And then when you're done, you simply merge the pull request. And then when you're ready to start again, you go to Master, make sure and refresh it, switch to a new branch. I'm not sure what the next one was, but let's just say it was 2 words. Then you're off to the races again, 1 of each word. So that just about does it. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out anytime on GitHub or in the Discord channel. I'm looking forward to reviewing your pull requests.